The photograph is ordinary at first glance, a broad European street, stone buildings rising 5 stories high, windows open, gas lamps installed, and yet no one is there. The image dates to the late 19th century, long after the invention of faster photographic exposures. The caption identifies the location clearly. The architecture is complete, the infrastructure operational, but the street is empty, unnaturally so. In the census records from the same city, the population appears to have doubled within a single generation. Thousands of new residents, entire districts suddenly inhabited. Yet the photographs tell a quieter story, one of absence rather than growth. An orphan intake ledger from 1721 notes children arriving with no recorded parents, no villages of origin, no surviving relatives. Only a single phrase repeats down the page, origin unknown. If civilization grew gradually, these records should align. If history progressed normally, these systems should make sense. So why do they all begin to fracture right after 1700? And what if what followed was not recovery, but replacement? The accepted story is calm and orderly. The 17th century ends in hardship, plagues, fires, wars, climate instability. The 18th century begins with rebuilding. Monarchies consolidate power. Cities expand. Trade networks stabilize. According to official history, nothing ends in 1700, it transitions. European textbooks describe this period as one of recovery and enlightenment. The Great Northern War concludes. The War of Spanish Succession settles territorial disputes. Nations emerge with clearer borders. Population registers begin appearing with greater frequency, tracking citizens who supposedly survived the chaos of the previous century. But the textbooks glide past the scale of devastation implied. Entire regions lose population according to fragmentary records from before 1700, yet by 1750 those same regions report thriving communities. The gap between collapse and recovery is described in vague terms. Gradual rebuilding, slow return to prosperity. Parish records from rural France show baptisms resuming after decades of silence. Land deeds reappear after unexplained gaps. Tax rolls suddenly contain hundreds of names where previously there were none. Official explanations cite the end of conflict, the return of displaced persons, the natural resilience of human populations. But when examined closely, the records don't show gradual recovery. They show sudden appearance. A village in Bavaria records 12 families in 1695. By 1720, it records 218 families. No migration logs explain the increase. No construction permits document new housing. The village simply becomes populated as if by administrative fiat rather than human movement. The architectural continuity is assumed rather than demonstrated. Engravings from 1720 show completed town squares, functioning marketplaces, established civic institutions, all supposedly rebuilt after devastation. But where are the construction records? Where are the accounts of timber purchased, stone quarried, labourers hired? The silence is mistaken for lost documentation. Perhaps it simply indicates there was nothing to document because the buildings were already there. Reflection. If this was merely hardship followed by recovery, why do so many records feel discontinuous rather than damaged? Disasters leave debris, abandoned construction, half-finished projects. This period leaves silence, and then sudden completion. For centuries, maps labelled a vast territory across the Asian landmass, Tartaria. The term appears in atlases by Ortelius, Blaeu, and Mercator throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Not a single unified empire, but a recognized geographical and cultural designation. By the early 18th century, the label vanishes, not gradually replaced by more specific regional names as cartographic precision improved, completely. as if the thing it described had been administratively erased from acceptable reference. Mainstream historical explanations claim the term was always imprecise, a European catch-all for poorly understood Asian territories inhabited by various Turkic and Mongolic peoples. Scholars note that Tartar was a medieval exonym, that no unified Tartarian state existed, that the label reflected European ignorance rather than Asian political reality. Yet the same supposedly imprecise labels persist elsewhere for centuries. Indies remains common well into the 19th century despite describing vastly different territories. Cathay and the Orient survive as vague designations. Why does Tartaria alone require complete removal from cartographic vocabulary? Maps from 1670 show Tartaria divided into regions: independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. These divisions suggest some level of understood internal structure, not mere ignorance. Trade routes cross the territory, cities are marked, rivers are named. Then, after 1700, the maps are redrawn. The same territories receive new labels. The Russian Empire expands across Siberia. The Qing dynasty is shown governing China's western regions. Independent Kanates are specifically named. The transition happens within a single generation of cartographers. No dissolution treaties document this change. No collapse narratives explain why a territory recognized for 200 years suddenly requires renaming. Just a quiet cartographic restructuring, as if Tartaria had become inconvenient to acknowledge. Names disappear when the thing they describe no longer fits the official narrative. Empires fall loudly: wars, successions, treaties, annexations. Why did this one vanish quietly through editorial decision rather than historical event? Before anomalies can be recognized, a baseline must be established. Official records provide that: foundation, census figures, city charters, building permits, population registries. In the early 18th century, European nations begin systematic record-keeping with new urgency. Prussia initiates regular census-taking in 1719. Sweden establishes formal population records in 1749. France begins parish-based demographic tracking after 1700 with greater consistency than before. The numbers tell a story of growth. Paris grows from approximately 400,000 residents in 1700 to over 600,000 by 1800. London expands even more dramatically. Berlin, St. Petersburg, Vienna all show steady increases. This is presented as natural urbanization. Rural populations migrate to cities seeking opportunity. Trade networks support larger populations. Agricultural improvements feed growing numbers. The Enlightenment brings order and prosperity. The architectural records align with this narrative. City plans from the mid-18th century show new districts, expanded boulevards, municipal buildings. Construction is noted, completion is recorded, and the cities themselves stand as evidence of progress. Photographs, when they begin appearing in the mid-19th century, show the results: grand avenues, impressive civic architecture, complex infrastructure. The narrative of gradual construction seems confirmed by visual evidence. This is the foundation we are told to trust. Growth follows naturally from peace and prosperity. Buildings are constructed to house expanding populations. Systems emerge to serve increasing needs. But baselines are only stable if the inputs are real. A foundation built on assumption can support only assumption. And when multiple data sources are examined together rather than separately, contradictions begin to surface, not as isolated errors, but as patterns. Census records claim steady population increase. Yet genealogical records show families beginning abruptly, lineages starting without clear origin points. Birth records appear in volumes that should require corresponding parent generations, but those parent records are thin or absent. Architectural records claim construction, but completion dates often precede population arrivals. Infrastructure appears before the supposed population density that would justify it. The baseline appears solid only when each data type is examined in isolation. Cross-reference them, and the foundation begins to fracture. What happens when every baseline rests on assumption rather than verification? By the 1850s, photography allows documentation of urban environments with unprecedented clarity. The technology advances rapidly, exposure times drop from minutes to seconds, allowing sharp images of dynamic scenes. Flags can be captured mid-flutter. Pedestrians can be photographed in motion without blur. Yet in photograph after photograph of major European and American cities, from the 1850s through the 1880s, the streets are empty. Paris, in an 1859 photograph by Charles Marville, shows the Boulevard de Strasbourg stretching into the distance, wide, paved, lined with five-story buildings. Gas lamps are installed, windows are open, awnings extend over shop fronts. Everything suggests an operational commercial district, but no one is visible, not a single figure in the entire frame. Official explanations cite long exposure times requiring stillness. Moving figures, the explanation goes, didn't register on the photographic plate. Only static elements, buildings, lampposts, paving stones, remained visible. But exposure time explanations fail under scrutiny. The shadows are sharp, indicating brief exposures. Flags hang motionless. If exposure times were long enough to erase people, flags would show motion blur. Windows are open and curtains are visible. If wind moved them during long exposures, they would blur. They don't. St. Petersburg, photographed in the 1860s, shows Nevsky Prospect completely devoid of human presence. The avenue stretches wide and grand, architecture impressive, infrastructure clearly complete. But the operational city contains no operators. San Francisco in the 1860s and 1870s presents the same pattern. Photographs show Market Street fully built out, infrastructure installed, empty, not under construction, not abandoned, simply waiting. These are not construction zones awaiting inhabitants. They are operational cities without citizens. The pattern repeats across continents and decades. London in the 1870s, New York in the 1880s, Chicago before the 1893 World's Fair. Each photograph shows the same unsettling characteristic: complete infrastructure, absent population. Perhaps the photographers simply avoided pedestrians for aesthetic reasons. Perhaps they photographed early in the morning before crowds appeared. Perhaps technical limitations we don't understand explain the emptiness. Or perhaps the cities were genuinely empty, grand infrastructure inherited rather than built, awaiting a population that would arrive later to claim it as their own achievement. A city without citizens is not growing, it is waiting. Waiting for whom? The numbers don't behave. In the United States, the first official census in 1790 records approximately 3.9 million people. By 1850, the number reaches 23 million. Official explanations cite immigration and natural birth rates. European populations arrive seeking opportunity. Families are large. The growing nation absorbs newcomers efficiently. But when examined closely, the mathematics become impossible. Immigration records from 1790 to 1850 account for approximately 2.5 million arrivals from Europe. Natural population growth from the existing 3.9 million, even with generous birth rate estimates, might produce another 8 to 10 million over 60 years. The total should reach approximately 14 to 16 million by 1850. Yet the census reports 23 million. 7 to 9 million people appear without documented origin. European cities show similar patterns. Berlin's population supposedly grows from 55,000 in 1700 to 172,000 by 1800, more than tripling. Immigration is cited, but where did the immigrants come from? Rural depopulation might account for some movement, but rural areas would show corresponding decreases. They don't. Rural populations also report growth. St. Petersburg presents an even stranger case. The city is founded in 1703 on marshy, largely uninhabited land. By 1800, it contains over 200,000 residents. Official histories describe massive construction efforts and forced labor, bringing populations from across the Russian Empire. Yet the infrastructure photographed in the 1860s appears far too extensive, too architecturally unified, too complete to have been built piecemeal over a century by forced labor battalions. Paris doubles its population between 1700 and 1800 despite wars, revolutions and periodic plagues. When birth and death records are examined, the increase exceeds what the documented vital statistics should produce. Migration is assumed to account for the difference, but migration requires origin points, and those origin records are conspicuously absent. In census after census, populations grow at rates that exceed documented inputs. The missing variable is always explained the same way: incomplete records from rural areas, poor documentation of migration, lost archives from earlier periods. But lost records should produce random gaps. These gaps are systematic. Consistently, the missing documentation is precisely the documentation that would explain sudden population increases. Growth without origin is not growth, it is appearance, as if populations manifested rather than migrated, as if the census recorded discovery rather than increase. You cannot inherit people from nowhere, yet that is precisely what the records suggest happened. By the 18th and 19th centuries, orphan numbers reach industrial scale. Not isolated cases of children losing parents to disease or accident, but systematic waves of children arriving at institutions with no lineage, no family records, no documented origin. The Foundling Hospital in London, established in 1739, processes thousands of children through its intake system. The records are meticulous, each child logged, each circumstance noted, but the circumstances are disturbingly uniform. Origin unknown, parents deceased. The phrase repeats across page after page of ledgers, not parents killed in fire, or parents died of plague, or parents lost at sea. Simply deceased, as if the fact of orphanhood required no explanation, as if parental absence was the natural state. In New York, the orphan train system begins operating in 1853, eventually transporting over 200,000 children to families in the rural Midwest and West. Official histories present this as a solution to urban poverty, destitute immigrant children sent to farms where they could have better lives, but the numbers overwhelm that explanation. The immigrant populations supposedly producing these orphans should, by demographic logic, have produced corresponding adult populations of struggling parents. Yet the adult poverty statistics don't align with the child abandonment rates. The orphans appear in greater numbers than the documented poverty could generate. Intake records from the Children's Aid Society show children arriving with no surnames, no village records, no relatives who could be contacted. Entire sibling groups appear with no documented parents, not parents who died recently, but no record of parents ever existing. In Europe, foundling wheels, rotating cylindrical devices built into church walls where infants could be anonymously deposited, process unprecedented numbers. Paris, Rome, Milan all report thousands of foundlings annually. The children arrive without names, without family markers, without any indication of origin beyond the immediate geographic vicinity. Official explanations cite poverty, illegitimacy, and social shame. Unwed mothers, destitute families, parents who cannot feed their children. The explanations are not unreasonable. Hardship does produce such situations, but the scale is what disturbs. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands upon thousands, year after year, across continents and decades. Entire institutions exist solely to process the volume, intake systems, housing systems, placement systems, all operating at industrial efficiency. Orphans imply loss. This implies erasure, not of individual parents, but of entire genealogical structures, as if a generation simply vanished, leaving only their children behind. What catastrophe creates children but deletes parents? Cathedrals present a persistent anomaly. According to official records, buildings like Notre Dame de Paris took centuries to construct. Foundation laid in 1163, completion around 1345. York Minster in England supposedly required 250 years. Cologne Cathedral's construction allegedly spanned 632 years. These timelines are presented as evidence of medieval dedication and gradual accumulation of resources across generations. But the records tell a different story when examined closely. They describe not continuous construction but renovation and restoration. The documents refer to rebuilding, restoration, repair, language that presumes prior existence. Notre Dame's 19th century restoration by Viollet-le-Duc is well documented. But Viollet-le-Duc describes finding construction techniques he cannot replicate, stone precision that exceeds contemporary capabilities, architectural coherence suggesting unified design rather than centuries of piecemeal addition. The star forts present an even clearer impossibility. These geometric fortifications with precise angular bastions appear across Europe, Russia, and the Americas during the 16th and 17th centuries. Official histories claim they represent advances in military architecture, responding to cannon warfare. But the uniformity is striking. Forts separated by thousands of miles show identical design principles, similar construction techniques, comparable scale. As if built according to a universal template rather than independently developed regional designs. The precision of the stonework challenges official chronology. Massive blocks fitted together with minimal gaps, foundations that have survived centuries without significant settling, acoustic properties in cathedrals suggesting advanced understanding of sound propagation, all supposedly achieved with pre-industrial tools. Civic buildings across major cities show the same pattern. City halls, opera houses, train stations, photographed in the late 19th century, they appear ancient and weathered, not newly constructed. Their architectural unity suggests synchronized construction, not piecemeal development over decades. Infrastructure appears before populations. St. Petersburg's palaces and grand avenues exist fully formed in early photographs despite the city's supposed recent founding. Chicago's civic architecture appears too extensive, too complete for a city officially founded in 1833 and largely destroyed by fire in 1871. Buildings are renovated, not built. Populations arrive to inhabit, not construct. Infrastructure pre-exists its supposed builders. The implication is uncomfortable. What if these structures were inherited rather than created? What if 18th and 19th century societies moved into a world already built, claimed it as their achievement, and wrote construction narratives to legitimize the inheritance? Renovation presumes something to renovate. If all we have are renovation records, what happened to the original construction documentation? Who inherits an empty world? The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago should not have been possible. The fair covered 690 acres, featured over 200 buildings, and attracted 27 million visitors. Official histories describe it as a triumph of American ambition and industrial capability, a gleaming white city constructed in just 2 years. But the scale defies the timeline. The Grand Basin alone required moving millions of cubic yards of earth. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building enclosed 44 acres under a single roof, at the time the largest building ever constructed. The architectural unity, Beaux-Arts classicism, executed with precision across dozens of structures, supposedly resulted from coordinated effort by multiple architectural firms working under tight deadline. Photographs from the fair show not hastily erected temporary structures, but monumental architecture with elaborate sculptural detail, sophisticated infrastructure, working fountains, and complex landscaping, all completed in 24 months on swampy lakefront land that required extensive foundation work. The official explanation cites staff, plaster, and jute fibre, temporary materials that could be shaped quickly. After the fair, most buildings were demolished or destroyed by fire. This explains why such grand architecture could be constructed so rapidly and why so little remains. But the explanation creates its own problems. Staff plaster buildings of this scale should have required extensive structural support. The engineering challenges should have been immense. Yet the construction proceeded with remarkable efficiency, as if the builders already knew exactly how to execute such a massive project. Paris hosted the Exposition Universelle in 1900, featuring similar architectural grandeur. The Grand Palais, Petit Palais, and Pont Alexandre III, all supposedly constructed for the exposition, remain standing today, permanent structures, not temporary exhibition halls. The architectural style repeats globally. Beaux-Arts classicism appears simultaneously in Chicago, Paris, New York, San Francisco, Buenos Aires. The same columns, the same proportions, the same sculptural vocabulary, as if architects worldwide suddenly accessed a common design language. The same orphan systems process identical volumes of children. The same census patterns show unexplained population growth. The same photographic emptiness precedes population arrival. And now the same architectural style manifests across continents within the same narrow time frame, not regionally, globally. Coincidence collapses under repetition. One empty city photograph might be explained by technical limitations. 2 might be coincidence. 20 across different decades and different photographers suggests pattern. Independent disasters do not synchronize. Independent developments do not produce identical results across vast distances. Synchronicity implies coordination or inheritance. The hypothesis forms quietly, emerging not from speculation but from accumulated impossibilities that official explanations cannot adequately address. What if civilization did not rebuild after 1700 but resumed? What if the infrastructure pre-existed its supposed builders? What if the populations arrived not as constructors but as inheritors, claiming a world already built? The pattern suggests a sequence. First, a global catastrophe around 1700, not localized wars or regional plagues, but something that affected populations worldwide while leaving infrastructure largely intact. Second, a surviving physical world, buildings standing empty, cities operational but unpopulated, infrastructure maintained or maintainable, not ruins, readiness. Third, a repopulation phase, populations arriving or emerging, census systems instituted, origin records deliberately obscured or genuinely unknown. Children appearing without documented parents, genealogies beginning abruptly. Institutions created to process and integrate populations whose origins cannot or must not be recorded. Fourth, narrative construction, founding stories written, national myths established, construction timelines asserted, the inherited world reimagined as built world, renovation records reinterpreted as construction records, gaps in genealogy explained away as lost documentation rather than genuine absence. The hypothesis is uncomfortable because it suggests our understanding of recent history, 18th and 19th centuries, not ancient or medieval periods, might be fundamentally incorrect. Not wrong in details, but wrong in framework. We have been taught that this period represents human progress, industrial achievement, and demographic expansion. What if it represents inheritance management? Census records don't show growth, they show documentation. Empty city photographs don't show technical limitations, they show actual emptiness. Orphan systems don't address poverty, they process populations whose origins cannot be established. Architecture doesn't demonstrate construction capability, It demonstrates preservation and occupation of existing structures. The official timeline requires believing that populations grew impossibly fast, that architecture manifested with unprecedented speed, that orphan numbers reached industrial scale due to normal hardship, that synchronicity across continents happened by coincidence. The reset hypothesis requires believing something happened around 1700 that official history has obscured, and that what followed was not organic civilization growth but systematic repopulation and narrative construction. Neither hypothesis can be proven definitively from available records, but one emerges from trying to reconcile official explanations with documented evidence. The other emerges from accepting that official explanations may be inadequate. Inheritance explains what construction cannot. Arrival explains what growth cannot. Documentation of discovered populations explains what birth records cannot. History may not be memory, but assignment. We remember what we're told to remember, documented in records that begin after the silence. To stabilize identity after demographic disruption, continuity must be asserted, even if manufactured. By the mid-18th century, national narratives begin to solidify with new urgency. Founding fathers are lionized, pioneer myths are established, revolutionary stories are told. Each narrative emphasizes fresh beginnings, new orders, enlightened progressions. American history presents a particularly clear example. The Founding Fathers become almost mythological figures by the early 19th century. Their wisdom, their vision, their unprecedented creation of a new form of government, all emphasized in educational curricula and public commemoration. But the narrative serves a function beyond inspiration. It establishes a clear starting point. Before the founding, there was colonial dependency. After the founding, there was independence and growth. The narrative provides origin, essential for populations whose genealogical origins may be unclear. European nations engage in similar narrative construction. The French Revolution becomes the ultimate historical rupture. Old order destroyed, new order created. Before 1789, Ancien Régime. After 1789, modernity. The narrative emphasizes discontinuity, which paradoxically serves to obscure earlier discontinuities. Russia's narrative emphasizes Peter the Great's transformation and expansion, a clear temporal marker after which everything modernizes and expands. The story provides explanatory power. Before Peter, Russia was backward. After Peter, Russia became great. St. Petersburg's rapid construction is credited to Peter's will and vision, avoiding uncomfortable questions about the scale and speed of the city's appearance. School curricula across Western nations begin standardizing in the 19th century, emphasizing these national founding narratives. Children learn clear timelines: American Revolution in 1776, French Revolution in 1789, Italian unification in 1861. Each provides a starting point from which progress flows. The narratives are not necessarily false. The events described did occur, but the emphasis serves a purpose, providing clear origin points for populations and nations that might otherwise lack them. If genealogies are truncated, national founding myths provide collective ancestry. If family records show gaps, national stories provide identity. If personal origin is unclear, national origin becomes the grounding reference. The manufactured continuity is sophisticated. It doesn't deny gaps, it reframes them as natural transitions between historical periods. It doesn't hide population increases, it explains them through westward expansion, immigration, and natural growth. It doesn't conceal architectural mysteries, it credits them to human achievement and progress. Memory can be written faster than stone can be carved. Stone buildings last centuries. Written histories can establish narratives within a generation. Who benefits from a seamless past? Everyone who needs a clear identity, untroubled by uncomfortable questions about where they actually came from. If the hypothesis is correct, if lineage begins abruptly post-1700 for significant populations, then ancestry is not deep but truncated. Genealogical research encounters consistent barriers around the early 18th century. Family trees extend back to approximately 1700 or 1720, then stop. Not because earlier records were lost, but because earlier records don't exist. Professional genealogists acknowledge the phenomenon. They call it brick wall research, the point at which documentation simply ends, and no amount of archival investigation produces earlier connections. Standard advice suggests trying different repositories, variant spellings, neighboring regions. But what if the brick wall isn't a research problem but a reality? What if families genuinely begin at that temporal boundary? Parish records across Europe show baptisms resuming after gaps. A church in rural England records no baptisms between 1690 and 1718, then suddenly begins recording dozens annually. Official explanations cite record-keeping disruptions during political turmoil. But neighboring parishes show the same pattern: synchronized silence, synchronized resumption. Immigration records in America show arrivals from Europe, but the European origin records often cannot be verified. A family arrives in Pennsylvania in 1730 claiming origin from a German village, but when researchers attempt to verify the German records, the village has no corresponding emigration documentation. The family appears in Pennsylvania but not before. Origin unknown appears not just in orphan intake records, but in land deeds, marriage registries, and military enlistment forms. A phrase that should be rare, reserved for extraordinary circumstances, becomes routine. Names appear without depth, families without prehistory, lineages that begin cleanly at a specific historical moment and are told to trace forward, never back. This has implications beyond historical curiosity. Identity rests on memory, memory rests on records. If records are truncated, manufactured, or deliberately obscured, then identity itself becomes uncertain. Who were your ancestors before 1700? The question should have answers: names, places, occupations. For many researchers, it has only silence. DNA testing in recent decades reveals unexpected patterns: genetic diversity that doesn't match reported family origins, ancestral connections that official records don't support, matches to populations that supposedly had no contact. The genetic record and the documentary record tell different stories. Both cannot be fully accurate. Either the documents are incomplete, or they describe populations whose origins were never properly recorded because they couldn't be or shouldn't be. What if your past was assigned rather than inherited? What if genealogy is narrative, not archaeology? Institutions persist, anchoring social order across generations. Churches, universities, government archives. Their continuity provides stability. Their authority rests on longevity. But when origins are examined, opacity increases. The Vatican archives contain millions of documents, supposedly providing unbroken documentation of Catholic Church history. Yet access is restricted, catalogues are incomplete, and researchers consistently report that pre-1700 documentation is significantly thinner than later periods. National archives across Europe show similar patterns. French state archives claim continuity, but researchers note that documentation becomes far more complete and systematic after 1700. Earlier materials are fragmentary, disorganized, or simply absent. Russian archives present particular challenges. Despite claims of extensive historical preservation, documentation from before Peter the Great's reign is remarkably sparse. The explanation cites fires and war damage, but the pattern is suspiciously convenient: extensive damage to early records, comprehensive preservation of later records. Universities claim medieval foundations. Oxford supposedly dates to the 11th century, Cambridge to the 13th. But institutional records, building documentation, and enrollment lists become verifiable only in the 18th century. Earlier materials exist, but their authenticity and continuity are less certain than commonly assumed. The institutions themselves are real and functional, but their claimed deep history may be more constructed than discovered, continuity asserted through narrative rather than demonstrated through unbroken documentation. Trust survives on repetition, not verification. An institution claims ancient foundation. The claim is repeated in official histories. The repetition becomes authority. Few examine the actual archival evidence supporting the claim, and those who do often find the evidence less conclusive than the confidence of the assertion would suggest. This is not necessarily conspiracy or deliberate deception. It may simply be institutional self-preservation. If an institution's origins are genuinely unclear, asserting continuity serves stability. If records are genuinely absent, filling gaps with reasonable assumptions serves function. But the result is the same. Institutions whose authority rests partly on longevity may have less documented longevity than their authority requires. The implication unsettles. If even major institutions have opaque origins, what does that suggest about the broader historical framework they supposedly anchor? Authority depends on silence being mistaken for stability. The absence of contradictory evidence is treated as evidence itself, but silence proves nothing. It simply permits assumption. Seen again with years of pattern recognition behind it, the photograph changes. The street is still empty. The buildings still rise 5 stories. The windows remain open. The gas lamps are installed. Everything operational, nothing inhabited. But it is no longer eerie. It is explanatory. This is not a city under construction, awaiting its first residents. Nor is it a city captured at an unusual moment when everyone happened to be elsewhere. It is a city inherited, infrastructure complete, ready for occupation, waiting for populations that would arrive later and claim it as their achievement. The census records still show population doubling within a generation. But now the mathematics make sense, not as growth, but as documentation. Not people being born into the city, but people arriving and being counted for the first time. The orphan ledger still reads, origin unknown, down the page. But now it reads not as administrative failure, but as literal truth. Unknown, because the origins genuinely cannot be established, because the systems that would normally document family lineage don't exist for these populations. The cathedral still stands, renovation records still describe its rebuilding. But the renovation language now sounds accurate, not building for the first time, but restoring what already existed, maintaining inherited architecture that predated the supposed builders. The World Fair photographs still show monumental architecture constructed impossibly fast. But if the architecture was inherited rather than built, the timeline makes sense. Not creation, but restoration and repurposing of existing structures. Everything that seemed anomalous under the official narrative becomes coherent under the alternative. Not civilization rebuilding, but civilization resuming. Not populations growing, but populations arriving. Not architecture being constructed, but architecture being occupied. The photograph still hangs in archives across the world. The streets remain empty in image after image. The question remains unanswered by official history. Who were these cities built for? Perhaps history did not forget. Perhaps it began again. And what we call the modern era is not progress from earlier foundations, but inheritance from earlier builders, a world received, claimed, and slowly repopulated by newcomers who wrote themselves into the narrative as creators rather than heirs. If this was a reset, are we the continuation or the replacement?